A rescue dog vanished into the forest just before a violent storm. 12 hours later, he was found guarding a wrecked van no one had reported missing. When the rescue team forced it open, what they saw inside made even the toughest responders freeze in place. All right, here's the full story. But before we jump in, drop your dog's name in the comments. And hey, if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, now's the time, because the next story, you'll want to be the first to see it. The backcountry road twisted like a broken ribbon through the dense pine forest of Washington's Okanogan Highlands. Wind had howled through the trees the night before, pulling down limbs, bending road signs, and lashing at vehicles caught out too long. A mid-autumn squall, unexpected in its severity, had left silence in its wake. A silence interrupted only by the distant call of birds and the low grumble of generators humming to life in scattered homesteads. But along one unmarked stretch near milepost 42, that silence was different. It was not peaceful. It was charged, suspended. A tan-coated dog stood by the edge of a ravine just off the road, completely still, its body covered in streaks of mud, its eyes fixed on the twisted shape that lay nearly hidden below the embankment. Not once did it whine. Not once did it move away. It simply stood there like a soldier on watch. That dog's name was Ranger. He had gone missing from a rescue unit 3 nights ago. The team had assumed he wandered off during a training break, something he'd never done before. Ranger was part golden retriever, part Malinois, trained for wilderness search and rescue since he was old enough to follow scent trails in wet grass. Highly intelligent, unusually quiet, and fiercely loyal, his handler called him the ghost with a heartbeat. But now, no one knew he was there. Not yet. The van below the ridge was barely recognizable. Once white, it now looked more like a crumpled artifact of steel and dirt, as if it had been violently planted nose first into the embankment. Its roof was dented inward, windows shattered, and the passenger side had collapsed against a moss-covered boulder. Ranger had found it the previous evening after tracking someone that no one else even knew was missing yet. No one had come looking. There were no police cars, no orange cones, no search parties, only Ranger. And Ranger was still standing guard 12 hours later when the fog began to lift and a road survey crew passed through that route for the first time since the storm. At first, the workers didn't notice him. The dog blended with the underbrush, but when they slowed to clear a fallen signpost, one of them caught the golden blur on the periphery, standing still, unmoving, watching them. "Did you see that?" one of them said, stepping out of the cab. "See what? There's a dog over there. He's not moving." They both walked toward the ridge, confused but curious. The dog didn't bark, didn't retreat, just turned his head slowly toward them as if to say, "Finally." Then they saw the wreck. A call went out immediately. County rescue teams were rerouted. By the time paramedics arrived, a light mist had started to fall again. Ranger hadn't moved. It was only when a familiar voice called his name, "Ranger! Ranger, is that you?" that he broke his silence, tail twitching once, then again. His handler, Meave Donovan, came scrambling up the incline. Her vest was half-zipped, and her hair soaked. She had been searching for him for 3 days without sleep. "Ranger, oh my God, what are you?" She dropped to her knees next to him, arms out, but the dog didn't rush to her. Instead, he walked 2 steps forward and sat down beside the van's crumpled side panel, nose pointing directly at the twisted rear door. Mai froze. She had seen that posture before. "Someone's in there," she whispered. She turned and shouted to the lead medic, "We've got a live alert. Rear panel." The crew moved quickly. No one needed to be told twice. Flashlights flicked on, tools came out of kits, and the lead technician slid down the incline with a pry bar in hand. "Van's cold," he said. Looks like it's been here since the storm. They pried at the side door, but the frame was warped. The windshield had spider web from the inside out, the hood folded backward from impact. There was no clear way in. The passenger seat was pushed so far into the dashboard that no adult could have survived the front-side collision. The front airbag looked like a burst pillow. The dashboard crushed inward like it had tried to eat the steering column. But Ranger wouldn't leave the rear door. Maeve crouched next to him, her fingers trembling as she brushed his side. "You stayed," she said. "You stayed all night." Still he didn't move. With great effort and 2 hydraulic spreaders, the rescue team finally created a narrow gap between the frame and the rear passenger side. The interior was dim, strewn with broken plastic and loose belongings, blankets, a child's toy, crushed paper bags. The smell of fuel was faint, as if the storm had diluted what might have leaked. And then, a sound. Faint, thready, not mechanical, not metal. It was breathing, human, confirmed breathing. Someone called out. "We have got a pulse in here, it's weak." But they couldn't see who it was, not yet. The person, if they were conscious, was buried under debris, trapped by the weight of twisted steel and plastic casing. They would need more equipment to extract them. Ranger let out a soft whimper, then stood up and moved closer to the gap, his nose pressing gently against the cold metal. Maeve's throat tightened. She remembered how he came into her life, found dumped outside an old ranger station when he was just a few months old. Too quiet to be a pet, too watchful to be normal. But when she brought him to the training fields, he picked up on search patterns faster than any other dog she'd ever handled. Some called it instinct, others luck. Maeve knew better. Ranger didn't follow scent like other dogs. He followed intention. He knew when someone needed help, even before they cried out. While the rescue team called for backup and waited for the hydraulic cutters, Maeve walked the perimeter. Ranger followed her briefly, then stopped and returned to the same spot again. "Still guarding," the medic said, shaking his head in amazement. "We wouldn't have even known the van was here if it weren't for him." Maeve nodded but said nothing. Her eyes moved over the terrain, the damaged trees, the trajectory of the wreck. It didn't look like a high-speed crash. More like a vehicle had slid during the storm, hit a patch of black ice, and rolled off the embankment. There were no skid marks on the road, no signs of impact with another vehicle, just a van that never made it to its destination. She checked the plates, no stolen reports, no missing persons calls in the system yet. That was the first mystery. The second would come when they finally opened the van. They worked through the next hour with practiced urgency. The door was stubborn, fused to the body. Cold rain began to fall again, making the tools slippery, hands slower. Ranger stayed beside Maeve the entire time, eyes never leaving the van. He hadn't eaten, hadn't drunk anything since they found him. By the time the backup team arrived with the right equipment, daylight was breaking through the trees. And then the door gave way. Metal creaked, snapped, and peeled, and what they saw inside made the entire team freeze. Maeve's hand flew to her mouth. Ranger stepped forward once, then sat again. Even the paramedics trained for battlefield trauma and mountain disasters were still for a full 5 seconds. Because inside the rear compartment, pinned beneath a mass of tangled debris, was not just one person. There were two. One appeared to be a man, older, maybe in his late 50s. He was unconscious, a deep laceration on his forehead and blood pooled around his shoulder. But the second figure was what made everyone pause. Pressed tightly against his side, still breathing, barely, was a small girl, no older than 6. Her arms curled into her chest, her face pale and streaked with blood and dirt. She was wearing a sweatshirt that looked 3 sizes too big, and beneath it, tucked against her, was something pink and woolen. A baby. There was a third person. A baby wrapped in a thin blanket, no older than a few months, her chest moving faintly with shallow breaths. 3 people, no identification, no missing report, a van that no one was looking for, and a rescue dog who had found them before anyone even knew they were gone. Maeve blinked as the medic beside her whispered, "What is this?" But Ranger already knew. He stepped forward one final time, and lay down at the side of the van. He had done his job, and the real questions were only just beginning. The baby was the first to be removed. Wrapped tightly in thermal blankets and passed gently from gloved hands to the arms of the paramedic, the infant let out a fragile wail, soft, sharp, and hauntingly human. Her cry was weak, but it meant one thing above all: she was alive. The little girl clinging beside her didn't speak. Her eyes were glassy, staring blankly at the canopy of tree limbs overhead, and her fingers remained clenched in the fabric of the man's jacket. Maeve followed the medic's every movement, her breath shallow as they worked. Ranger, exhausted but alert, sat just beyond the extraction perimeter, watching every step as if he were still on duty. The man, older, built solid but now crumpled and broken, was barely breathing. Shallow inhalations rattled through him as he was lifted from the wreckage. A cervical collar was applied, and he was immediately placed on a backboard. There was blood beneath him, soaked into the carpet and upholstery of the van's interior, and multiple wounds marked his arms and ribs. Still, no one spoke. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet, as if even the birds paused to listen. 2 children and 1 adult. One of the paramedics murmured as they loaded the victims into the waiting ambulances. "But who are they?" Maeve shook her head. No answers, no ID, no plates matching an alert, no alerts even filed. How was it possible? She approached the van slowly, ducking under the tarp the rescue team had stretched across the rear entrance to shield the inside from rainfall. A few personal items had been recovered: a child's drawing folded beneath a juice box, a satchel with snacks, diapers, and some baby wipes. The man's wallet was nowhere to be found. No mobile phones, no personal records, but something did catch her eye: a single photograph tucked into the flap of a cloth pouch near the back seat. It was crumpled and slightly stained, but still legible. A woman and 2 children, one the little girl they had just pulled out, and a baby in the woman's arms. No man in the photo. They stood in front of a small weathered house, the kind you'd find deep in the hills, where driveways were gravel and mailboxes leaned sideways. Maeve turned the photo over. No writing, no names, no dates. She stared at the image for a long moment, then slid it into an evidence bag. By the time the last of the victims had been transferred, Ranger had finally lain down in the wet pine needles. Maeve crouched beside him and rested her palm against his ribs. "You knew," she whispered. "You always know." She still couldn't believe it. 3 days earlier, during a simple training hike, Ranger had pulled from her side and vanished into the brush. It wasn't like him. He never broke pattern, never left unless commanded, and even then he never went far. But that morning, something had changed in him. Maeve had searched until dark, then called in every available hand to find him. Not because she feared he'd been attacked, but because if Ranger had gone off track, he'd gone for a reason. That reason had been a crushed van and 3 lives hanging by a thread. But what had drawn him? No sounds, no calls for help. The storm had drowned any cries that might have carried through the forest. Still, Ranger had found them. Now, with the sun beginning to rise higher in the misty sky, Maeve knew her role wasn't over. She needed answers, and not just for her own sake, because the questions piling around that van were more troubling than anyone had realized. At Okanogan Regional Medical, the ER intake was already buzzing with activity. The infant was rushed to NICU, stabilized with warm fluids and placed under heat lamps. The little girl listed as Jane Doe remained silent during her examination. She responded to touch but didn't speak, not even a word. The man was in critical condition, barely clinging to life. He'd suffered a fractured pelvis, multiple broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and what doctors feared was a brain hemorrhage. If he woke up, it wouldn't be any time soon. Maeve stood quietly in the corner of the ER's observation wing, watching from behind a partition. Her badge allowed her access, but not answers. Ranger sat beside her, now cleaned and wrapped in a towel after being briefly checked by the hospital's vet tech. The attending nurse approached slowly. "The baby's stable," she said softly. "Cold exposure. Some signs of dehydration, but she should recover fine." "And the older girl?" The nurse paused. "No signs of trauma. No broken bones. She's in shock, emotionally unresponsive. And she has a scar. A small one, healed, just beneath her hairline at the temple. Old head injury probably from before. But we don't know who she is. Has anyone claimed them? Not yet. Nothing in the system." Maeve took in the news. How could 3 people disappear, crash in a remote part of the forest, and not have a single person looking for them? Then she remembered something. 3 weeks earlier, a fellow officer in another district had mentioned a quiet call, a report of a woman who hadn't shown up for a check-in. The woman's sister had filed it, saying she hadn't heard anything in nearly a month. The details were vague. No concrete address. The woman had moved frequently. Domestic issues, she'd said. No police record, no custody battles, just vanished. Maeve hadn't connected the dots until now. She pulled out the photo. The woman in the picture had eyes too tired for her age, like someone who had carried a weight no one else could see. The baby was clearly the one in NICU. The girl matched the Jane Doe in room 203. But no woman had been found at the scene. Maeve's skin prickled. She called the local sheriff's office and made the request pull every missing adult female report from the past month, especially any with ties to Okanogan or surrounding counties. She wasn't a detective, but she'd learned from Ranger when the trail doesn't make sense, trust the instinct, and right now everything felt off. Later that afternoon, Maeve returned to the crash site. She couldn't explain why. Something unsettled her. The van had been towed, the debris marked and cataloged, but the land still bore signs of the wreck, scratches on trees, broken brush, bloodied soil. Ranger led her again, sniffing the ground, tail low, then he stopped. At a tree about 20 feet uphill from where the van had landed, a mark, no bigger than a man's palm etched into the bark. Blood. It wasn't much, just a smear, but fresh. And it was not from the original crash. Maeve moved slowly. Ranger began circling a patch of forest. He picked up pace, turned left, then right, then stopped. Maeve crouched. In the underbrush, barely noticeable, lay something that didn't belong. A child's sock, tiny, pink, drenched from the storm. Maeve turned it over and found the embroidered letters stitched into the heel. LM. Her breath caught. The baby's name? She had no proof, but the sock had not been inside the van, which meant someone else had been out here. Someone else had moved, and maybe someone else had left. The adult female in the photograph. The mother. Maeve's heart pounded in her chest. She turned back to Ranger. He was alert now, nose to the ground, sniffing the sock. Then he began to move. Maeve followed. They didn't go far, just down the slope toward a narrow ravine. There, beneath a tree hollow, barely visible through the brush, Ranger stopped and lay down, ears twitching. Maeve knelt beside him. There were footprints, faint, distorted by rainfall, but human, and the toe of a boot. She scanned the area, hands brushing aside leaves and ferns, a scrap of fabric, a piece of torn coat. Then, a ring. Simple, silver, tarnished, but engraved inside with initials, E.W. Maeve's breath caught. Whoever this woman was, she had tried to leave a trail, subtle, deliberate. She wasn't lost. She was hiding, and for some reason, she hadn't wanted to be found. The storm returned with quiet menace, rolling in from the north as twilight bled into the pines. It wasn't the kind that snapped trees or took down power lines, just persistent, chilling rain, soft enough to pass for mist, but cold enough to cut through every layer of fabric. Maeve stood once again at the edge of the ravine. Ranger was beside her, still, watchful, listening. She'd marked the coordinates where she found the torn coat scrap and ring. No new tracks had appeared overnight, no additional evidence, and yet the deeper Maeve thought about it, the more it seemed deliberate. The sock, the fabric, the ring, each left like breadcrumbs. No panic, no chaos, more like a farewell. She walked carefully now, not because of the terrain, but because she was stepping into someone else's silence. Maeve had worked SAR long enough to know that some people didn't want to be rescued. They didn't cry for help, they vanished in whispers, not screams, and often the reasons came too late to change the outcome. But this time was different. This mother, whoever she was, hadn't vanished. She had left behind the only things that mattered more than her own life. 2 children, a van, a man with no name, a sock in the dirt. Maeve felt it now. The truth had been woven into the ground long before she arrived. In the hospital's children's wing, the little girl, still listed as Jane Doe, sat propped against white pillows. Her hair had been washed, her arms bandaged from minor abrasions, but she remained mute, her gaze drifting from the rain-speckled window to the blank ceiling tiles. Then the door opened. Maeve entered slowly, holding something in her hands. A stuffed animal, whole, slightly torn, but unmistakably shaped like a dog, the same as the keychain clutched in the girl's hand the day before. Maeve sat on the edge of the chair near the bed. "I found this in the van," she said softly, placing the toy near the girl's knee. "Looks like he belongs to you." The child looked down. Her fingers moved slowly, tentative, like reaching into cold water, and then she touched the fabric, pulled it close, and held it. Maeve waited. No questions, no pressure. Then the girl did something unexpected. She pointed, not at the toy, not at the bed, but at the door. Maeve turned. Ranger stood there, motionless, waiting just inside the threshold. The girl's lips parted. A breath. Then, "Dog," she whispered. Maeve didn't move. Her chest tightened. The child looked back down at the stuffed animal, then up again. Her second word came not as a whisper but with clarity. "Ranger." Maeve stood. The silence broke like thin glass. The investigation had reached its tipping point. Fingerprints had been lifted from the van. DNA swabs processed. Still no matching ID in the national database. But a call came from Idaho. A social worker in Bonner County had seen the photo Maeve submitted. She didn't recognize the man, but the woman, yes. Her name was Elena Winters, mid-30s, no criminal history. A history of moving often, sometimes with a partner, sometimes without, always with her 2 daughters. The girls' names were confirmed: Lily, the older one, and Mira, the infant. The man in the van? No legal connection, not the girl's father. According to the case notes, he had joined Elena's life months earlier, an ex-con turned self-help disciple, controlled, manipulative. On paper, nothing illegal, but the woman had filed a welfare concern twice and then dropped it. One report mentioned planning to leave. The next thing anyone knew, they were gone. Maeve hung up the phone. Now the story was no longer just a mystery. It had a name, and with that name came a truth deeper than any file could contain. She returned to the ravine that night. The rain had slowed to a mist. Fog clung to the treetops. Maeve crouched where Ranger had first stopped after finding the ring. She closed her eyes and replayed it all. Elena had fled. packed the kids in a van, waited for the right storm, drove a back road to nowhere. And when the van lost traction and tumbled down the ridge, she had done something almost no one could have done. She had pulled herself from the wreck, found her baby still breathing, wrapped her tighter, checked Lily, shaking, bruised, but alive. Then Elena had made a decision, not to climb toward the road, not to call out, but to hide them, tuck the baby into the rear panel where the airbags had formed a cushion, pull Lily close, make it look like the three of them had been alone. And then she vanished. Maeve believed it now. The way the sock and ring were left, not dropped, but placed, the way the crash concealed the van from the road. Elena hadn't wandered off disoriented. She had disappeared on purpose. Maeve's throat tightened. Not to run. To protect, because maybe the man had survived the initial crash, and maybe Elena knew that if he lived, he would lie. Say the girls belonged to him. Twist the story. So she vanished to let truth survive on its own, and somehow, impossibly, she left Ranger with the scent carried on wind and trauma and purpose. He had followed it, found the wreck, stood guard until the world came looking. 2 weeks later, Lily finally began to speak in full sentences. Her voice was quiet but steady. She told the caseworker about the night of the crash, about the big noise, the tree branch that broke the windshield, how her mother tucked her baby sister into her jacket and said, "Stay here." "Did she leave to get help?" the caseworker asked gently. "No," Lily said. "Why did she go?" "She didn't want him to wake up first," Lily answered. The caseworker froze. "Did your mom say where she was going?" Lily nodded. "She said Ranger would find us." In the quiet recovery room, Mira cooed in her crib. Lily sat beside her, drawing something with crayons. Ranger lay on the floor between them, head resting on his front paws. Maeve watched from the doorway, silent. She wouldn't ask any more questions. She wouldn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than words ever could. A month passed. The case closed with a note, "Mother presumed deceased, body unrecovered." Authorities assumed exposure and terrain claimed her, though no search team ever found her.